Hello, I'm Emma Belsky. From 2021 to 2022, while I was a student at Mount St. Mary's University, I interviewed several professors about texts that they loved teaching and reading. I'm happy to share these recordings with you now as the Grade 8 podcast. Enjoy!
Welcome back to the Grade 8 podcast. This is Emma Weinheimer, and I'm here with Dr. Josh Hochschild, and we are going to be talking with Dr. Greg Murry about Machiavelli's The Prince. I think it's worth mentioning this time that Dr. Hochschild is the director of the Philosophy, Politics, and Economics program at the Mount, and Dr. Murry is the director of the core curriculum program, and he's also a professor of history. So welcome to both of you. Thank you for coming.
Thanks, Emma.
Thank you, Emma.
So, Dr. Murry, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, your areas of expertise, etc.?
Yeah, so I traditionally am a historian of the Italian Renaissance, and my specialty is actually Florence in the 16th century. My first book was on the sort of next generation of what happened after Machiavelli. And eventually what happens in Florence is the Republic fails. The Republic that Machiavelli was a part of and that wanted to see thrive. Fails in the 1530s, and the Medici, who had sort of always often been the sort of powers, the movers and shakers of the Florentine Republic, sort of definitively take over as monarchs. Machiavelli didn't live to see that, but he wouldn't have liked it at all. But as part of that, I deal with the legacy of Machiavelli as people discover his writings and they start thinking about his writings. I've published an article on whether or not Machiavelli's Christian passages, so to speak, the parts of his work where he seems to speak like a Christian actually indicate that he took Christianity seriously, and I argue that he actually didn't. And I've also written on a response to Machiavelli, this whole genre of literature that develops in the 16th and 17th century in response to Machiavelli. It's known as the anti-Machiavellians. And for a long time in Machiavelli's reception, the anti-Machiavellians were sort of the predominant voice. Most people for the 150 or so years after The Prince and the Discourses were written thought that Machiavelli was wrong about basically almost everything that's in them. So,
were they referring to the actual text, The Prince, or were they referring to other works of his and other ideas?
Mostly The Prince is the one that starts to circulate and that really rubs people the wrong way. When thinkers in the 16th and 17th centuries are thinking of Machiavelli, they're thinking of either the things that they've read in The Prince or the sort of ideas that they've absorbed secondhand, the things that they associate with The Prince.
Okay.
In the 18th century, so that's latter 17th century in England and then the 18th century in France, people rediscover the Discourses. And the Discourses are a less famous work that Machiavelli had written about Livy. So it's basically Machiavelli trying to divine the lessons from Roman history that he's gotten from reading Livy, and primarily Livy's conversation about the Roman Republic. And so the Discourses become an important thing that people start reading as republicanism becomes a prevailing philosophy in Europe. And so that happens at different times. It happens in the 17th century in England, in the 18th century in France, and then also in the 18th century in America.
Okay, awesome. So you mentioned your expertise is Florence history. So can you give us a little bit more context for The Prince itself?
Yeah. So The Prince is probably the most famous job application that has ever been written. So what happens in Florence at the time is that Machiavelli had been a part of one of the various iterations of the Florentine Republic. And that republic first fails at the beginning of the 16th century when the Medici have the good fortune to be elected pope and they come back into power. And as a part of their coming back into power, Machiavelli gets caught up, and we don't know whether he was actually involved in this or whether he was just indicated as being involved in this, in a political conspiracy against the Medici, and is tortured. He's extremely proud of the fact that he was tortured without cracking, and he is then sent into political exile. So the two things that I think about Machiavelli's personality, having studied him for a long time, is that he really did love Florence quite a lot. He was a patriot, and he loved his homeland. In fact, he says at one time that he loved his homeland more than his soul. That actually tells you a lot about Machiavelli. And the second thing is that he's like Beto O'Rourke. Like, he's just a guy who thinks that he was born to be in it, right? And so part of the sort of trauma of exile for him is that he looks at everybody and he always thinks he's the smartest guy in Florence. And he always thinks that if people would just listen to him, right? If people would just listen to him, everything would go better. And so the prince is dedicated to the Medici and is a sort of job application saying like, look, I know you guys are going to be monarchs here in Florence. I've thought a lot about what it takes to be a successful monarch and to have a successful republic. Read this, and then please let me come back and have a job because I was born to be in it. You got to listen to me.
Was it literally written as a letter to them, or was it something that he'd been working on that he then sort of tailored to address to them? Because the timing was just right?
It's not a letter. It's a political work. But like most political works at the time, it has a dedication. It was dedicated to ruling Medici at the time. And so it's sort of like a gift, right? To have something dedicated to you is something that's pretty typical, either when you want to gain favor with someone who's in political power or when you want, employment from someone who's in political power. It's a pretty common move. He wasn't doing anything that wasn't ordinary for the time.
So it's like, oh yes, I dedicate this thought to you.
Yes, that's exactly right. That's exactly right.
Okay. As I recall, in the West Civ 200 class, there is the dedication letter before the actual document, the prince, yes.
That's right.
Okay. So, did you have anything you wanted to say, Dr. Hochschild?
Well, in a minute, I think, we're going to ask you to sort of summarize the content of it. And,
yes.
And that might answer this question. But you are a high-powered scholar. I don't know if you remember this, but when I got to go to Italy with the Mount Study Abroad, I saw your book in the gift shop of the Medici Church Museum.
Hold up. Hold up.
Totally cool. Totally cool. I think I texted you a picture of that. And I can see why this is something fascinating to scholars of Florentine history. And I can also see why someone would fall in love with Florence. But you use this text with like students today and ask them to think about its relevance to their lives. And I'm sort of wondering how to make that connection between the kind of deep historical awareness that you have of the value of this text and why it would be something that undergraduates would read as part of a core curriculum.
That's a good question. I mean, you're really actually hitting at like a major sort of divide in the history of ideas. That is, what are great texts for? Are great texts basically these things that exist outside of time with these great ideas that, you just enter into the sort of ideas and you think about them, divorced from their historical context? Or is the purpose of reading great text that you really have to sort of understand the text in its time, in its place, in its sort of context? And of course, I think the answer is both, right?
Right.
So you will understand the text better as a great text if you understand the historical context from which it was produced. But understanding the historical context from which a text is produced is sort of like so what do I do with that? Unless you're also operating with questions like, what does this mean for our own political system? Right. What does it mean for our own life? What does it mean for how I behave?
Presumably the text addresses something that's accessible even before you're filled in about the historical context. So there's a kind of question there that people could identify even if they don't know the historical details, although it might be harder to decipher or easier in some cases.
Yeah, I think that's one of the reasons why Machiavelli is used so often is because the question that he poses in it is essentially, does the ends justify the means? And that's a really important question.
Sure.
For not only politics, but for anybody who's making any moral decision ever, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Essentially.
Yeah.
And so that's the sort of perennial question. Now, one thing that's sort of great about Machiavelli, one thing that makes it a great book, is that he clarifies that question and sharpens that question in ways that make it really difficult to sort of hedge on it. And the other thing that he does is in a number of very short number of pages, he gets right at the heart of that idea sort of without cluttering you with, exposition, so to speak.
Sure.
So I think Machiavelli is important for everybody to be aware of because of the extent to which his idea that the ends sometimes justify the means, or to put it more specifically, that evil means can sometimes be justified for good ends, has so sort of infiltrated modern thought in a way that would be totally foreign to any sort of pre-modern thought, that it's really helpful for us to be aware that that was an idea that was interpolated into the Western canon,
right.
And isn't just a natural way of thinking, right? And in fact, you might say that the more natural way of thinking, or the sort of prevailing moral platitude that dominated Western thought from, let's say, Plato and Aristotle and Cicero on, and through the Catholic intellectual tradition is that it's never okay to do something that's intrinsically evil, even if you're aiming at good ends.
Right. So maybe you could give us an overview of how the text is structured and how he manages to make space for a different answer to that question.
That is so good. So traditionally, the text is like divided into like three major parts. And the first part of the text is, I would say, like the least read part of the text. Like if you're not going to assign something, you don't assign that part. In fact, that's the part I actually don't assign to my students. So what he's doing in the first part is he's giving a typology of different principates. So the word he uses in Italian is principato, but essentially he's talking about monarchies. So he divides all forms of government up into two forms. This is actually abnormal. The traditional way to divide regime types up is the rule of the one, the rule of the few, and the rule of the many.
Right, that goes back to Plato and
Going
Aristotle.
back all the way to Plato and Aristotle. And then to distinguish between the good forms, which are the forms that practice justice, and the corrupt forms in which people act in their own self-interest. Machiavelli doesn't do that, at least not in this text. He divides up everything as either a monarchy or a republic. So it's a repubblica or a principato. And he's just going to dispense with the republics. He can say, I've got another book for that. That's the Discourses. And then he's going to look at different types of principates. And he thinks that's really important because he thinks it's really important for a prince to know what type of principate he has got, or she actually. There are female monarchs in Europe at the time. What type of principate you've got, because that will dictate what you need to do in order to maintain your position in. And so he distinguishes between a hereditary prince who might be able to get away with some things and a new prince who's constantly be on the lookout, or between a prince in an elected monarchy, like for instance the Pope is an elected monarch at the time, or a prince in a civil state or something like this. And that's what the first sort of part of the book, maybe the first 10, 11, 12 chapters are really focused on. And then in the second part of the book, this is the part that if you only assign one part, it's going to be the second part. That's the part where he basically stops. I think it's in chapter 15, but he basically stops and he calls out Plato. Like basically like throws down the gauntlet at Plato.
Got to go for the top.
He goes right after Plato and he says, I'm paraphrasing here, but he says something along the lines of like, listen, I know people have written about imaginary republics and those republics have never existed. And that is a complete waste of time, right? We should not look at how the world should behave. We should look at how the world is. And then he lays out his sort of principle, which is, look, if you want to be morally scrupulous and do the things that people are called good for in everyday life as a prince, you're surrounded by people who are not good and who are not going to do what you do. And so you do that, you pave your way to your own ruin. That's what he says. You pave your way to your own ruin. Sometimes, and this is critical, right? Because Machiavelli is often caricatured in many ways that are actually not really helpful, right? Yeah. He's not saying do bad things all the time, and he's not saying like be a schemer, right? Like what he's saying is that
being realistic or taking pragmatic steps. Is that how you'd put it?
I think this is one of the things that's sort of often misunderstood about the prince is that people will often say, well, Machiavelli is sort of trying to teach the prince how to be selfish and self-seeking. And this is actually Rousseau's interpretation of the prince. He thought that the prince was a satire and that Machiavelli was kind of hinting like, oh, actually, if you have a prince, they're going to behave terribly like this. This isn't my read of it. My read of it is more something like this. So Machiavelli, like Aquinas and like basically all the philosophers who came before him, thinks that the primary end of the state is something that you might call the common good. Like Machiavelli is not against that idea. And that comes out very much more clearly in the Discourses. But Machiavelli thinks, I think, and remember that almost every polity in Europe at the time is ruled by a monarch, right? Like republics are very rare, right? Florence is a very rare instance of a republic.
Yeah, this was pre-Enlightenment, correct?
Pre-Enlightenment thought, yeah,
yes.
Absolutely. Pre-Enlightenment, so in the Renaissance. And so he doesn't have the same view of monarchies that like we do. Like I tend to think like when Americans think of monarchies, it's like George III, tyrant, and like
Queen Elizabeth.
Queen Elizabeth,
awesome.
Yeah, awesome. Or somebody like, or Hitler and Stalin, right? The sort of fascist monarchs of our own age, right? But that's not the case, right? In the 16th century. In the 16th century, monarchy is pretty much thought to be like the only way to go. And the only examples of republics that they have are Athens, which they thought was terrible and short-lived, and Florence, which was kind of like, also like Athens, terrible and short-lived. So anyways, so all that being the case, like monarchy didn't really have the bad name that it had at the time. one of the unstated premises of The Prince is that Machiavelli doesn't think that it's in anybody's interest, not the prince's interest and not the prince's people's interest, for the prince to behave in ways that's going to get him overthrown, right? Like the whole idea of the prince is like, how do you behave in such a way that you can maintain your state? And that's a selfish end, but it's also an end that like is directed towards the common good, because what's the alternative? Somebody bumps you off.
Chaos and ruin.
Right.
Yeah, somebody bumps you off and there's chaos, right?
Yeah.
Survival is a precondition of being able to do anything good in the future.
Yes,
right?
yes,
So
that's exactly
if
right.
you can't maintain the position,
That's exactly
then
right.
you can't do any other good.
So in serving himself, the prince is also serving the state in this sense. And so I think that's one of the things that people sort of misunderstand about Machiavelli. Okay, so that being the case, right, how does the prince maintain his state? Well, sometimes the prince needs to do things that we would consider vicious or sinful or awful, sins against what would have been called the natural law. And so the middle portion of the text is essentially a gauntlet throw to Plato, who says, well, Plato says that the philosopher king should act morally. Well, no, not right. Not always, Plato. Or
He
And
should, but
it's
he
always
can't
better
always.
to suffer injustice than to do an injustice.
yeah,
right?
exactly.
That's the principle behind it all for Plato.
Yeah, that's right. Or Cicero. And Cicero actually extends Plato to say not only is it better to suffer an injustice than to do an injustice, but actually justice is a much better policy. That is that you're always probably going to end poorly if you are in the habit of practicing injustice or being dishonest. Those are actually like a way in which Machiavelli is in stasis with the classical tradition on two levels. One at the level of value and the other one at the level of cause and effect. So all that being said, Machiavelli says, well, not always. And that's another key. It's like, he's not saying go around and be evil all the time. He's saying like, there may be occasions where you have to be evil. And that's actually a much more nuanced view than the caricature that we get of Machiavelli. It's much harder to contend with what he really says than with the caricature of what people say that he says. And so he's taken a lot of these categories directly from Cicero. In fact, Dr. Rupp says like, it's almost as if Machiavelli had like a Cicero in his lap while he wrote this and was like, wrong, because all the categories come from Cicero. Should you be honest? Should you be cruel? Should you choose to be more feared than loved? Should you be thought generous or not? And Machiavelli sometimes says, like, for instance, with generosity, like, no, why would you ever want to be thought generous? Like, you're just spending other people's money if you're the prince. And with things like cruelty, he's like, well, maybe sometimes you got to crack a few eggs to make an omelet.
But if I'm hearing you right, he's not saying you ought to always be thought the opposite, but he's saying you shouldn't seek too hard to be thought the virtuous. Is it like a kind of indifference? Like you have to be willing for people to think that you are ungenerous or cruel, because in order to do the right thing, that might be one of the consequences?
It's actually operating at both levels, right?
Okay.
So it's operating at the level of you actually need to be ready to be cruel.
Okay.
Regardless of what people will think of you. Mm-hmm. And because you need to be ready to actually be cruel, you have to be prepared that some people will think you cruel. Although the best scenario is that you can act cruelly without people thinking that you're cruel. If you can pull that off, that's what Machiavelli wants.
Isn't it even better if people fear that you could be cruel, but you never have to exercise cruelty? Isn't that another classic Machiavellian line, that it's better to be feared than to be...
Well, he says that it's better to be feared than loved. And so this is about how one maintains loyalty.
Okay.
And his point about that is he says, well, first off, you have to say this. Machiavelli has a very, very, very negative view of human nature in general. Yes. Very negative view of human nature. You feel like maybe he was taunted on the playground, or that he was broken up with by a girlfriend at some point, and he just never...
I'm pretty sure there's a section.
I'm sure there are whole books about the psychology.
In The Prince, or there's somewhere where he's dealing with like how to deal with women after being broken up with or something like that, and I was like, oh my goodness.
So you're referring to the Fortune is a Woman.
Oh, that's what that is?
Yeah.
Oh,
okay, so and Fortune is a woman, right? So in the Romance languages, words have genders.
Yeah.
So Fortuna is a woman. It's gendered as a woman.
Boethius made that famous through the Middle Ages.
Right.
Dressing Lady Fortune with Lady Philosophy. Right?
Yes, that's right. And so this gets to like, okay, so how does one manage the fact that in life some things are in your control and some things aren't? Okay, so, and in politics, right? Mm-hmm. So in politics, so Machiavelli conceptualizes this through the two categories, interestingly enough, of virtu and fortuna. Fortuna is a woman. Virtu comes from the Latin word vir, which, if you've done your Latin, is man. So virtue is a man and fortune is a woman. Virtue is the portion of life, right? Machiavelli is best translated as something like the sort of competence that allows people to do great things, right? That's the masculine sort of nature of virtue. Strength. It's not really translatable because he uses it in all sorts of different ways. But like, I think the best strength is part of it, but it's not identical with strength. And fortune is that part of life that, like, stuff happens. And he says, like, it's like half and half. Half of the outcomes of your action are in control and half of your actions are out of control. Mm-hmm. So what do you do with this fortuna part? Machiavelli says, well, you act boldly. When there's like two courses of action to you, and you can act passively or you can act boldly and actively, you should act actively. It's not really an argument. It's more just like a poetical metaphor, right? He says, fortune is a woman. And sometimes you got to hold a woman down and beat her to get her to do what you want her to do. And so that's sort of a metaphor used for like how one behaves, which offends modern sensibilities for all sorts of reasons, legitimate reasons. Yes. Right. But we were back to the question of why you need to do bad things, which I think is essentially, that's at the heart of the argument of the prince.
Sure. Can we connect that to sort of rounding out the summary?
Oh, yes. Well, okay. So
after now the first and second part.
Yeah. So
part 3.
Then the third part is essentially one chapter, and it's mostly of historical importance. It's called The Exhortation to Liberate Italy from the Barbarians. And by the barbarians there, he means the French and the Germans and the Spaniards who have started to infiltrate it. So to Italians, French, Germans of the day, those are the barbarians. And it's addressed maybe to the Medici, but maybe to someone else to essentially unite Italy and throw these other people out.
One question that I know people have about Machiavelli was he a Christian?
I wrote an article about that.
Well, maybe you could give us the bottom line.
Okay.
Or do you think it's the wrong question to ask?
No, I think it's a good question to ask. And the reason I think it's a good question to ask is because it's not really a historical question, right? Like when Machiavelli was alive, they had this idea of Christianity and what a Christian is. And people of his day said, that guy's not a Christian. Right? Like they read his stuff
Christian
and they said,
wouldn't say that.
Yeah, Christian wouldn't say that. There's been a couple of revisionists who have, in fact, there's a Pulitzer Prize winning book called Machiavelli in Hell, which said like, well, he's an irreverent Christian, but Christian ideas deeply inform his thought. And there have been several other books and articles that have drawn out those sort of implications. And I kind of reject that. So I reject that on the ground that at the time, at least, and maybe this isn't true today, although I wish it were, at the time, that central premise that it's sometimes okay to do things that are intrinsically evil, even if you have a good end, that nobody would have recognized that as a Christian premise in Machiavelli's day.
I'm just curious about the linguistic matter. Does he use the category intrinsic evil?
No.
But he's talking about acts that people would have identified as.
Yeah, the word he uses is male, which actually can mean bad or evil. It's sort of got a semantic range that's much bigger than our question. But Italians do use it for evil. Right. So I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought there. Was the question again was
part 3?
Well, part three, but also is that the right question to ask?
Oh, is that the right question to ask? Was he a Christian?
You think it's clear that he was not, and that he was willing to embrace being identified as outside of the church?
That I don't know. I'm not sure about that. I don't think I know enough about his life. But he does use some Christian passages. I would actually say it's more the opposite, in that whatever his religious views were, and he's been characterized as all sorts of things, like he wanted to go back to the Roman pagan religion. That's what he really was, a pagan. Or people have said, well, he's an atheist, right? He doesn't believe in God at all. Whatever his actual religious views were, which he kept very close to the chest, he's willing to use Christianity or Christian ideas in a rhetorical way.
Right.
And this was the sort of idea of my article, was that, look, you can't ignore the fact that even if he wasn't a Christian, he's surrounded by almost everybody else that is identifying as Christians, right?
He knows his audience.
He knows his audience. He absolutely knows his audience. And so you can see that in the places where he references God and he references Christianity, you can see that sort of he's appealing at a rhetorical level. Sort of like, okay, we would be much better off with Roman paganism. It's a much better religion for the sort of society that I want. But I'm stuck with Christianity. How do we make the best use of Christianity? So, like, for instance, one of his critiques of Christianity is that it makes people weak. It makes them more apt to suffer an injustice than to act boldly and strongly and to do an injustice when they need to. So there's the question of, well, did he identify as a Christian? And like, who knows, right? But then there's a question of like, can we say that Christianity and the strands of Christianity as it was understood at his time deeply informed the way that Machiavelli conceptualized the world? It doesn't seem like it to me.
Interesting. So when he wrote this, he intended it as a work for the Medici monarch or Pope? Or were they one and the same at the time? Just a couple clarifying
Well, the Pope was ruling in Rome, and then the Medici, I'm trying to remember, it's Lorenzo, I think, was his relative. I can't remember exactly off the top of my head, but who was ruling at the time basically as a monarch.
Okay.
In Florence.
Just, I guess, to maybe start to hash out the implications, do you think he intended it to be read by like regular people? Because what I'm hearing from what you're saying about how a monarch needs to keep his position, obviously not all of us are monarchs. Did he want regular people to read it and think, okay, so
this is how I get ahead in life?
To make sure I get on that on-ramp so I can get to my destination in time, I'm gonna slam on the gas and like run that red light a little bit.
That is a great question.
Okay.
There's a book, I think it's called like What Would Machiavelli Do? Like Rules to Getting Ahead in Business or something like this. And so, yeah, so this is a real good question. So A, who is his audience? And I think clearly he intends his audience to be more than just the Medici.
Okay.
Although it's not published in his lifetime. But it's just the type of guy he is. Like, I mean, he thinks he's so smart, right? And so I think certainly he has a wider audience in mind for this particular book. But then that's a separate question from, is the thing that he's saying a prince should do something that he thinks was actually really valuable in like ordinary people's daily life, like you're talking about? Shall I think like as I walk up to, you know, discuss with my wife whether we should go to this movie or that movie, I need to think, well, you know, people will be dishonest with you and she will be dishonest with me. So I need to behave in such a way that like, I assume my wife is always being dishonest with me or something like that. Did he mean that like we should take his lessons and apply them to daily life? That's a different question. So if you look at the way in which he speaks about what he says a prince should do and how a prince should behave, he says a prince needs to do things very specifically that are like not the things that we would ordinarily call good, right? So ordinarily we would say that dishonesty is like an evil thing and like rightfully so. So that seems to indicate that this advice is just for princes, right? And the reason why it would be different for princes than for you, I think, but this is an unstated
is because I'm not trying to rule a country.
Yes, that's exactly right? Like a prince's self-interest is aligned with the common good of the people in this sense.
But like,
so he is assuming that.
I don't know though. I don't know
that, but like,
I don't know.
Both of you are fathers. Like, would you be able to take anything from the, like, not that you would tell devious lies to your children or anything, but like, do you think that parents could take, oh gosh, I had my question and I lost it.
No, it's a great thing. That's
like because you to the rule.
Yeah, is there an analogy because you are?
It's better to be feared than loved. Take
or
that to
be
heart.
afraid of how much they love you.
Or as you suggested, could you justify lying to your kids? So, I mean, in a strict sense, I guess a Christian doesn't want to say you can lie, but you might. I don't know a parent who doesn't recognize that kind of creative misdirection and deception is sometimes really useful.
And I ask that because you both, as the fathers in your household, you're in a position of power and your interest is the common good of the whole family. At least I would hope so. And I guess like on the, how did you put it? Creative
misdirection.
Yes.
So you could operate this at three levels, right? Like you could say this advice is only for princes because princes have the highest possible responsibility, which is the duty to their kingdom.
Yes.
Or you could say these principles apply to anybody who has to lead a group and aim at the common good. So they would apply, for instance, to a father. Or you could say these are just like good ways to get ahead no matter what.
Presumably scale matters though, right? So within a family, it might not work to extend it so far as to say that it's better to be feared than to be loved. And the closeness of relationship might mean that there's a different way you would apply the Machiavellian principle, but in large political entity, like ruling a whole city or a whole province, what would they call?
Yeah, well, in this case, they call it a number of different things, but it would be a ducato eventually.
I mean, the notion of the common good applies, but the kind of friendship one has with members of a family is different from the kind of friendship a prince can have with members of the state he rules. So even if, as Emma's suggesting, the principles of Machiavelli might apply, it might take a lot of work to figure out how to transform them for the proper scale of relationship.
Yeah, Machiavelli never does that. He never gives us any clue as to whether or not he thinks this applies for like a basketball coach or, he doesn't. And in fact, I'm not even necessarily sure that he doesn't think that this actually could apply to anybody. I don't know the answer to that question.
If he thought it only applied to princes, it is interesting that he was willing to let the secret out and have non-princes know.
Yeah, it's true.
I mean, you said it was published posthumously, but he intended it to be published?
I think so.
Okay.
I think so. Yeah. So that's an interesting question. It's interesting that you bring up the family, right? Because, Cicero says that it's better to be loved than feared. And this is one of the things that Machiavelli is responding to. But one of the things that the anti-Machiavellians will take Machiavelli to task for is that, like, Machiavelli actually says, before he says it's better to be feared than loved, first he says it's better to be both.
Sure.
Right? Mm-hmm. Obviously, it's better to be both. Mm-hmm. He just says that's really hard to do. And so normally you've got to pick one. You've got to pick fear or love. And his argument is that, because men control whether or not they'll love you and you control whether or not they'll fear you, do what's in your control and make them fear you. But the sort of anti-Machiavellian commentators didn't say, like, a ruler shouldn't be feared. They almost never say that. They say one of two things. They either say, like, Machiavelli's wrong about whether or not it's possible to be both feared and loved. And the example that they most often give is a father. A father is feared and loved.
They might give the example of God.
Oh, God is another one, right? Okay, so that example is given often too. And then the second thing that they say is that what Machiavelli is wrong about is that someone should make themselves feared, but not by cruelty. Someone should make themselves feared by justice. Justice is actually a motivator of sort of righteous fear, just like the father loves the child and yet punishes the child, and the child is afraid of the father for his justice. And just like God loves us, but also punishes us, and we're afraid of God for his justice.
Sure.
So
yeah, and certainly within the family, punishment doesn't work if children believe it to be cruelty and not justice. Like, they might not always agree with it.
My kids, I don't know about yours, Josh. Mine almost never think it's justice.
No, they don't, but there has to be a part of them, it seems to me, that recognizes that the parent is trying to achieve justice and not just enforcing something arbitrary, even if they don't agree.
Don't give your kids Machiavelli to read, by the way. Like, I gave my daughter Machiavelli to read, and now I just get Machiavelli spewed back at me whenever I try to discipline her or anything like this. I also get the Magna Carta spewed back at me often with the insistence. I said, like, look, the family is not a democracy. It's a monarchy. And she came back with, well, the medieval English monarchy was also a monarchy, but they had the Magna Carta at least, right? Like, what do I have?
How do you find students respond to the text when you read it in a classroom? Do they think he's articulating common sense ideas and have a hard time understanding why it would be so provocative? Or do they then start to see, there are some assumptions that we make about politics that are kind of historically contingent, and we could imagine a way of thinking about politics that was otherwise?
I think that they often sort of get flustered by the way in which Machiavelli makes sort of the choice so clear, in that they would like to generally think of themselves as like Ciceronians, right? Like, at least personally, they'd like to say, like, most people want to think of themselves as good people and not practicing.
And we want our rulers to think of themselves that way,
not practicing vice, right? So people like see it that way. But then when you give them the sort of Machiavellian dilemmas, right? Like, so what if to save 1 million people, we have to torture and kill an innocent person?
Right.
Well, okay, so now that's a little bit different. And that's, Machiavelli would clearly say, what do you even need to think about? Of course you should kill that one person. And so now that sort of flusters the sort of image they have of themselves as people who would never do awful things. But what if I was put in that particular situation? And then you get this sort of, I don't want to call it a cop-out, but like people saying that, like, well, I would never want to have to make those Machiavellian decisions, but I'm glad that somebody else does. In politics, it's called the dirty hands problem.
Right. Yeah. Yep.
Right? We don't necessarily want to have to do evil things, but we're glad that we have politicians who are willing to do them for us.
Yeah.
And so I remember an article by David Brooks in the New York Times, maybe from 2016. He was taking like a great books course at Yale or something like this, and they had just read Machiavelli. And his takeaway was like, yeah, well, Machiavelli like explains drone strikes, like why we need drone strikes. That was his sort of takeaway. And he's like, sure, Machiavelli would say, if you can save 100 innocent lives by potentially killing one innocent person on an errant drone strike, you shouldn't even need to think about that. That's just obvious moral arithmetic.
Maybe it's unfair to associate it with Machiavelli, but there's a reason why sometimes Machiavellian and realpolitik are thought to be near synonyms, right? If you're applying Machiavelli at the level of state or international politics, you do what you have to do to survive, and you don't let the moral problems intervene.
Yes, so it's very clear that like what Machiavelli is writing in terms of the sort of moral relationship of the prince to his people, he also conceives as the proper relationship in international politics. That is, in the same way that a prince might have to do evil or cruel things to his people in order to keep the state going, any sort of ruler or even a republic, right, even the Roman Republic, might have to do similarly cruel or dishonest things to its enemies in order to come out on top in the realm of international politics. It's crystal clear that like sort of he's the progenitor of that whole line of thinking of realpolitik.
Do you have any other general reactions from students to Machiavelli? Before I give my initial reaction to reading it.
Well, I mean, so this is weird. Like I always think about this, like Machiavelli is like the great books, but like he's also like a teacher of evil in some sort of way. So in what ways is that great? I actually always sort of struggle with that. And it's sort of like hard because, we read like a lot of hard stuff. And so like after reading John Locke in the original, like what is he talking about? John Locke, right? Like Machiavelli is so crisp, clear. Like he is such a great writer. Mm-hmm. And he frames these things in such sort of clear ways that part of what's great about Machiavelli, and this is a terrible thing to say, is that he's sort of purveying ideas that many people feel are awful in a really sort of attractive and like compelling sort of way. Mm-hmm. There's a skill to that. There's something that like I think people admire. And I think actually that's part of the rush that people have to reclaim him and say, no, he's actually really influenced by Christianity. Or another thing that people will say is, no, the Prince is a satire. You see the real Machiavelli in the discourses. And in the discourses, he's a little more reticent to tell people that they should do awful things. But in the discourses, he also says crystal clearly, when the survival of the state is at stake, no question of justice, cruelty, religion, humanity, or inhumanity should be taken into account. I mean, that's essentially the same premise as the sort of major premise that underlies The Prince. So it might be the case that Machiavelli thinks that republics are better because they have to do evil things less often than princes, but he still would say sometimes they need to do evil things.
I remember when I first read it, I definitely was really struck by how to the point Machiavelli was, just because like I was used to reading these texts that they did get to the point eventually, but there was just kind of like, okay, well, here's this side and here's this side and here, let's be Plato and we'll think about this for about 20 pages and here we get to the point. And there would be that debate with students. There was some debate in the classroom, but like it was a lot of really shocked silence at like your own self-realization that like, oh wow, I'm actually not as good a person as I thought I was. But what we couldn't quite get to, like you've mentioned that people will try to, I guess, save Machiavelli's face by calling it a satire and say like he was really focused on the Republic. And like this is something that like I've talked to with my other fellow students about like how serious, like you think this was written purely seriously?
Personally, so this is a debate in the field.
Yeah.
And it's a debate that goes back at least to Rousseau, so at least to the 18th century. Mm-hmm. I think he's deadly serious about it. In fact, I know he's deadly serious about it. I know the satire thing is wrong. And I've got an article in there somewhere, but like this, like a book just came out like 2 years ago that was like, if we decode The Prince and read it this way, we see that he's not actually being serious. So there's two things here. So one is all you have to do is read The Prince. So the evidence is all right there in The Prince. So in chapter, I think it's 16, in which he famously talks about cruelty and whether it's better to be feared or loved. The example that he gives of a polity that was wrong to be too merciful is the Florentine Republic, right? He says, like, look, Cesare Borgia, who was like operating as a prince, like he had it right? So he was cruel, he was thought cruel, he did really cruel things, but look at, like he was a new prince in a territory that was like in chaos. So he was cruel for a little while, he pacified them, united them, and that everybody was better off for his cruelty.
Okay.
And he says, in juxtaposition or contradistinction to that, the Florentine Republic allowed this place called Pistoia. So Florence is basically in a valley. It's in the Arno Valley. And then surrounding it are a bunch of mountainous regions. And mountainous regions tend to be factional, right? Like all the great feuds come from like mountain people. That's because of the sort of relationship of mountains and the way they cut people off and sort of make people form really strong group identities. So Pistoia is this mountainous region right outside of Florence that Florence had conquered. And it's riven by factions, these two bloody factions that are constantly they're like the Hatfields and the McCoys, or like the Montagues and the Capulets. And it was the Florentine Republic's sort of policy of leniency towards them that Machiavelli says, look, they were clement. Like, this republic wasn't cruel.
And look where it got
And look where it got these people. So, okay, so republics are supposed to behave like that too then, I guess, right? So there goes that theory. And then the second one, and this is the more smoking gun one, is that, Machiavelli is the entire time that he's writing The Prince and the Discourses also writing letters to some of his friends who are still in politics, because remember, he thinks he's the smartest guy.
Because he was writing this from exile,
He's writing it from exile, yeah. So, but he's also writing letters that basically say many of the same things, giving much of the same advice, giving the same analysis of, some of the people who show up in The Prince itself. And so there's good evidence that he meant what he said when he wrote this. At least I think there's good evidence that he meant what he said.
And just from my course reading from it, I do remember the one bit of sound evidence I do remember off the top of my head was there was talk of don't form alliances because by that logic you owe people something. I was like, okay, that makes sense. So how much else of this does he mean?
Sure. So if there's, if he doesn't mean any of it, well, and that's why we should expect all the advice to be bad, shouldn't we?
No, yeah, exactly. Yeah. And honestly, that is why I don't form alliances with my brothers and sisters when we're playing outside, because then I owe them something.
Because you can assume that
because they can turn on me if they feel like it. My little brother can, with his big brown eyes, he can turn on me anytime he feels like it.
And you should
don't tell me he won't.
So you should not be honest with them.
It seems to me like we can draw a great general lesson here about what we mean by the great books. I mean, you made the point earlier of saying this. If your interpretation is right, we might not think that Machiavelli is saying great, that is to say very good things, so might be very dangerous. And that suggests that the great books aren't necessarily books that we all agree with. And I think most people who talk about the great books would admit that, first of all, it would be impossible to agree with all of them because a lot of them
disagree with each other, right?
Part of the reason they were written was to express disagreement with other ones. But it's fascinating to me that there is this ongoing scholarly debate even about how to interpret a book that is so sort of clear and direct, as you describe, right? Because we do know, too, that there are great books that do seem to be have been written with a kind of coyness or indirection or misdirection of the desire to hide. Maybe
Utopia is a great example.
Utopia is a good example. I mean, even Plato's Republic, people argue over how much that is really meant as a work on political philosophy, or is it something else? People argue over whether Descartes really, intended to prove the existence of God, or was he even a Christian? These are all ongoing debates. But that suggests a richness to the text, that there's something there that keeps us coming back and looking for things, and why texts like that will continue to hold fascination. And the other thing it strikes me is that what you've identified, it's not so much the answer that Machiavelli gives, which does get our attention, but the questions that he's asking are still our questions, right? Is it okay to do evil to affect some good end down the path? Do the ends justify the means, as you put it at the beginning? But also, what virtues do we look for in a leader? How much do we ourselves value being loved versus being feared? Should we expect rulers to be willing to be ruthless? You could reframe so many, current debates at any given time in terms of these questions. Right. So it seems like every generation will be able to go back to Machiavelli and see something of their experience in his reflection. We didn't talk about what do you think a great book means, but I've just suggested a great book means something that has a richness that can't really be exhausted by a single generation of interpretation, and that it poses questions that we're all always asking.
Something of perennial value, right? Even if that value might be in forcing you to examine your own assumptions in a really sort of difficult way, right?
Yeah. You have something of a great books background yourself. Do you want to say something about that?
Oh, I think it's better to read great ones than not great ones.
But why would you want to read
less great?
Not really. No, not really. Although I remember very clearly that my grandfather passed down a set of the great books.
Like the Chicago
Chicago Library set to my mother. And so we got those when I was probably about 7 or 8 years old, and they sat on the shelf at the top of my hallway.
Sure.
And I pulled the first one off, which is, I think, it's the tragedies. It's Euripides and
that would make sense.
Sophocles. And
Yeah.
I couldn't make heads or tails of it at all. One of the sort of like ways in which I marked my progress as, a knower of things or like a sort of competent thinker is as I gradually started to be able to decipher more and more of what was going on in the great books. And I would pull one off the shelf and read a little bit of it and put it back on the shelf.
If I can interject, as someone who doesn't quite know all of the works that are in this Chicago list, can you... So you mentioned some of the Greek playwrights.
Yep,
I would presume that there's Plato and Aristotle as well. Like, so who are some of the authors that are in that?
Yep, Plato, Aristotle, the Greek playwrights. The set I had went all the way, I guess, to William James, but it would be Galileo, Newton's Principia. It would be Thomas Aquinas would be in there.
Augustine is in there.
City of God.
Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau are all in there. Some more obscure from the undergraduate perspective, more obscure, like Plotinus is in there.
Yeah. Francis Bacon.
And how many
Bacon
volumes is it? It's about 100, 150 volumes?
Yeah, something like I know it filled up like a shelf and 3/4 or something like that.
Wow.
Yeah. And the print is super duper small, so it's a lot.
With really thin Bible paper.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Really thin Bible paper. That's exactly right.
Nice.
Yeah, and it's controversial in the sense that, it was interpreted as a publisher or the editors behind the publisher trying to say these are the great books as if other ones aren't, or as if the canon is fixed. I don't know anybody who sort of feels a fondness for so-called great books who think that there's an obvious fixed canon. There are some certain figures that we think it would be crazy to leave out, like Plato.
Great is an adjective. It's not like it's a compound noun. It's
That's
not
right.
the great books. It's like books that are great. If we were just to reframe it as books that are great, I think there would be less sort of pushback on the idea of great books.
But there's a challenge because when people say, well, what kinds of things do you mean? You start writing a list, and then people could think that list is meant to be final.
Right.
It's exhaustive, yeah.
And I think one of the interesting things about it is that you can argue about whether this book belongs. Maybe The Prince doesn't. Maybe it's really fascinating and fun to read, but maybe it doesn't reach the level of... I'm just picking on that one because we're talking about it today. But there are arguably books in the Chicago series that it was a stretch to put them in there, and there's arguably books that could have been there. But
the Principia is basically unreadable, right? For a modern person, right?
Yeah.
That's basically where Newton lays out the foundation of modern physics, essentially, right? Like,
okay.
But it's essentially
Newton's
unreadable.
important, but is the book something that belongs in a curriculum?
Is that the best way to teach the laws of gravity or like that's right.
It's a library.
Yeah.
That's
meant to be added to.
Is a library that most of the books in there, we would say, for a long time have proven to be valued and influential. And it's the fact of their longevity as part of an ongoing conversation of the growing of the library that keeps them in there. But then there are books that, like Once Upon a Time, I think the Timaeus would have counted as a great book because it was the main Plato dialogue that was known through some of the Middle Ages.
That's the one that he's holding, I think, in the
Raphael's,
School of Athens.
Exactly. Yeah. But I don't remember if Timaeus is included. I mean, they had to choose which Plato dialogues, and there's a lot. So they put the Republic and maybe one or two others, but I don't know if Timaeus is in there.
Probably not.
But if you're studying intellectual history, Timaeus is invaluable.
Well, we're only 2 episodes in, but it's sounding to me like the case for having a definitive list of great books is not necessarily the most intellectually sound. And that we discussed Merchant of Venice with Dr. Sean Lewis. And to be honest, I was a little surprised that we were going to be talking about one particular Shakespeare play as a great book. But I think that Dr. Hochschild, you put it very eloquently that there's an ongoing conversation that we can still debate and talk about. Like we spend an hour talking about Merchant Venice and politics and stuff just with that, just us two. Yeah. So I think that having that ongoing conversation that we can, even if we disagree from it, like we can learn new perspectives and at least like clarify our own beliefs from it. So far, that's what a great book is sounding like to me.
It's really well put.
I agree.
Dr. Hochschild or Dr. Murry, did either of you have any final comments you wanted to make about great books, Machiavelli, The Prince,
Did you come
Florence,
to
the Medici?
say anything about Machiavelli that you didn't get a chance
Well, he's
to say?
wrong, right? That's
Got
the
that
thing.
on
He's
the
wrong.
record.
So he's wrong on 2 accounts, right? So he's wrong on the stasis of value. Plato's right. It's better to suffer an injustice than it is to do an injustice.
Oh, we could do a whole podcast on that.
You could do a whole podcast on that. Yep. And if you're a Christian, right? There's a really clear reason for that. And that is because the soul, the eternal part, which is offended by you doing injustice, is a far more valuable part than the body, which is offended by an injustice being done for you. So there's a crystal clear reason why not, if you believe in the soul, if you believe in heaven, hell, and eternity and all that sort of stuff.
Well, specifically, since you mentioned Christianity, it's really hard to understand and value the sacrifice of Christ if you don't think that it's better to suffer an injustice than to commit one.
That's right.
Right? I mean, that only makes sense within that framework.
So that's part of it. But then there's the other part of it, which is, does his political philosophy actually do what he says it will do? Does acting like Machiavelli says actually achieve the ends that he says it will achieve? And I think that Machiavelli's wrong on the basis of human nature. That is, Machiavelli has mistaken what Christians would traditionally call original sin for a view of human nature that humans will basically act dishonestly and badly all the time.
Whenever they can get away with it.
Whenever they can get away with it. And that might have been Machiavelli's experience with human beings, but that's probably not most of our experience with human beings, right? Like, that's not our experience in like the day-to-day. And I'm really interested in this concept of like game theory and game theoreticals. And there's a researcher out of Harvard whose name is Martin Nowak. And he has done a lot of work on this thing called the prisoner's dilemma, which is essentially it's a sort of thought experiment. Do we have a little time for this?
Can you make it brief?
Yeah. It's basically a thought experiment which sort of tests whether or not people are likely to be honest in situations where dishonesty will be of personal benefit to them. And when you solve the game theoretical, right? Like when you do it from a mathematical perspective, like it's always better to be dishonest. It's always better to choose dishonesty. But we find that and I do this all the time with my students when we read Machiavelli and when in my historically based games class, when I actually ask them to do the prisoner's dilemma, I just did this with my class, and every person except for one chose to remain honest even when dishonesty would have benefited them. And the one person who didn't said, "Oh, I pressed the wrong button." So
there was a little bit of talk of the prisoner's dilemma in the Samuel Bowles book that we read in the Thinking Politically class.
Nice.
So it's empirically verifiable that people act altruistically, not just some of the time, but a lot of the time. In fact, maybe even most of the time. And there's, a lot of...
And if you want to prove that people are going to act dishonestly, then you're going to set up the study so that they do. I mean, not all the time, but
true.
But by the logic of what you're saying, like if you want to prove that people are bad, then you set it up in a way that there's no other way that they
what Nowak was actually looking at was like from an evolutionary perspective, like what's the evolutionary benefit for a member of a species who acts in ways that are personally beneficial when they act selfishly, but can have, sort of group level beneficial effects if they act unselfishly. And so there are a lot of animals that do this sort of thing. Ants are a eusocial species, or bees. I mean, think of like a worker bee, right? Like
willing to sacrifice for the whole.
Yeah, will sting you and kill themselves in order to protect the hive. That's an act of altruism. And so the question is, if evolution sets us to be competitive and selfish, how do you explain the bee? How do you explain the ant? How do you explain like a vampire bats will share meals with each other? And then how do you explain human beings who act altruistically, like demonstrably, verifiably, all sorts of times? And the answer that these guys have come up with, well, actually altruism gives us not only an evolutionary advantage, but it may be the evolutionary advantage. It may be the thing that makes humans so much more capable of surviving as a species than anything else. It's the thing that we've got over people. So if we assume a Machiavellian sort of view of human nature, maybe we're giving away like our greatest advantage as a species.
Wow. Well, thank you very much. It was very thought-provoking. Yeah, thank you for coming, Dr. Hochschild, and thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Murry. This was fantastic.
All right.